Hello there, and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to take you through the process of connecting to data that's stored in a database. In our case, we're using an Impala instance. However, this process is pretty much transferable to every kind of database, from Redshift to MySQL to Mongo. Let's get started. Jumping into our Zoom Data instance, we go to Sources, which is in this gear menu. Alternatively, you can use the hamburger menu and click this and hit Edit Data Sources. Same place. And now we want to select what type of data source we want to connect to. In our case, we're connecting to an Impala data source. So let's click that. Now we got to give it a name to our new source, and we're going to call it FAA Flight Data Impala. Hit next. Now this is going to be new to you guys. This is the connection page. This is where you input your credentials to connect to various data sources. Now I'm going to enter some credentials to connect to the Impala cluster that has the data for this video in it, but your connection should be provided. Let's give this a name. We'll call it admin and user training source. And in our case, this database is actually accessible from this network that this instance is in, so we don't need a username and password. But in a lot of cases, you're going to need a username and password. This URL here, it's called the JDBC URL. The username and the password should be given to you by a technical resource who set up the database. Now, before we can move forward, we're going to have to click this validate button. And validate does two things. When we click it, it tries connecting to the database and makes sure there's actually a database at this URL and you didn't type it in wrong or anything. And the other thing it does is it saves this connection. So now in our use validated credentials list, we now have admin and user training source. And these credentials will be saved, so if you want to connect to another table in this data source, you don't have to re-input this information. If you ever want to manage your connections and your credentials, you can go to Sources. I'm opening it up in a new tab so I can show you guys. And then in the top right here, it says Manage Connections. You click that, you can see all your different connections. You can see how many sources are using it. You can see the information about it. And you can also get rid of it if you don't want this connection to be saved in Zoom Data anymore. Now, keep in mind, if you do that, the sources that depend on this connection will break as well. So you're going to want to remove those sources before you remove the connection. All right, moving on. In this screen here, we're going to want to identify what table we want to use. In our case, we're looking for the table Farlinium flights under the support schema. But depending on what type of source you're connecting to, the information that will be shown here can be slightly different. For example, if you have indices instead of tables, that's going to be reflected here. Now, once we've selected our table, we can check what columns from that table we want to include. And you see when we click that, this data preview here will update to show us exactly what's being brought into Zoom Data. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if you want to look at something more complicated than a single table, for example, a join or a view, you can use this custom SQL button here and start typing your own SQL. And that will let you actually create much more complex views into your data. Now, we don't need that right now. We just want this Farlinium flights table. So let's click that. Fantastic. And looking at the data preview, everything looks fine to me. These types look right. All right, we're ready to move on. Before we do, though, I want to point out this caching and Sparkit toggles. Caching, as I mentioned in the CSV video, is really helpful. It speeds up the load times of your dashboards and your charts, and you generally don't want to turn it off unless it's somehow causing a problem for you. Spark.it is a feature that ingests data into an internal Spark cluster. This feature is actually going away soon, and so you should consider it deprecated, and you shouldn't turn it on for any new data sources. All right, let's move forward. So this field should be very familiar from the CSV video. This is field management. And I went through what all of these columns do in the uploading a CSV video. I will go through them in some detail here, but if you want a more comprehensive run through of these columns, then you're going to want to take a look at that video. So visible here checks whether or not these fields show up in your visualizations. So you can uncheck these, and it's like you didn't upload these fields into the data source when you create a visualization. Field ID shows you what Zoom Data sees this field as from the underlying data source, but not what it displays it as. Label shows you what Zoom Data displays it as. So if you think that the name of a field from the database isn't something you want showing up in your visualizations, like if you have a better idea for an access label or a name for your users to use in the visualization, then you can change it here. For example, volume is really vague and generic, so I want to change it to number of flights, because that's what this volume metric is going to show us in this data source. It shows how many flights are being grouped into that visualization. Type lets you define fields as different types. We have one attribute field for things that are getting compared against one another, like airlines. We have three types of integer types. We have integer, number for decimals, and money for money-specific logic. And it's great for things you want to do math on, like delays, like minutes spent in the air, like miles traveled. You might want to find the average amount of miles traveled, or the flight with the least miles traveled. Now, an example is flight number, which is an attribute. It's a number. You could put it as an integer, but you're not going to want to find the average flight number. You're not going to want to find the total number of flight numbers. You're not going to add them all together or do any kind of math on them. Rather, you might want to compare them. You might want to be like, let's filter all the flight numbers to the flights that were American Airlines and see which American Airlines flight number had the longest delay. So if you're comparing things, you're going to want to save that as an attribute. And luckily, our underlying data source actually has this listed in as an attribute, so we don't have to change it here because Zoom Data has already pulled it in as an attribute. If we wanted to, though, we could. Up here, this column's new for us. This is called partition. So this table is actually partitioned, which is something that Cloudera Impala allows us to do to speed up our table and allow real-time time playback. And Zoom Data will actually take advantage of this partitioning technology if you tell it to, which we will. So we're going to set partitioning to date for scheduled departure day, and we're going to set the partition field to scheduled departure. And that'll let Zoom Data take advantage of the partitioning. Moving on to configure. So this field here lets you configure specific settings or defaults having to do with each field. And what shows up here is dependent on the type of the field. So for example, arrival delay is an integer. And so this is the default aggregation. So by default, do you want it to show the sum of all the arrival delays, the average arrival delay, the maximum arrival delay, or the minimum? Now we want average both for arrival delay and departure delay. When you create a visualization, you can change it back to like sum or max or min, but by default, we want it to be average. It'll just save us a lot of time. Attributes don't really have settings to configure. Times do, though. Times are treated differently from attributes and integers and numbers. Times let you filter by time ranges and play back through time. You can change your time pattern here. You can change your time zone or your granularity of the time. Over here is distinct count. What this will do is it'll bundle duplicates into one count. So for example, if you have 500 flights, and you set up cancellation reason to distinct count, maybe of all those flights that were canceled, there were 3 different cancellation reasons, so the distinct count will be 3, even though the total count is 500 because there are 500 flights. For more info on this, again, I go over this in more detail in the CSV video. And if that doesn't fully answer your questions, the Zoom Data Knowledge Base also has a wide range of really fantastic reference information about how these functions all work, little detail about how it works under the hood, and when to use it and when not to. Moving on, this filter display column here lets you select what kinds of information you want to display. For example, for integers, you can display a range of information. So if you only want to look at air system delays that are more than 10 minutes, you can filter it that way and it won't show up in your visualization if it's less than 10 minutes. For attributes, you can check only allow custom values. And what that will do is it's really useful for security reasons. Let's say you're using this on HR data and you have a page for salaries. If you hit only allow custom values, you would have to type in an individual salary to be able to filter in that system by that salary. Otherwise, it'll show you a list of all the different salaries and you can click which ones you want. So this is useful for niche applications where you don't want a whole list of all the different attributes visible. This last thing here, info, shows information that's been uploaded from the underlying source. In our case, we don't actually have any additional info for any of these columns, but if we did, it would show up here. Okay, when we hit next, it will move on to the scheduler. So this is useful for database sources. You didn't see this at the CSV because CSVs are strictly historical information, because you can't upload new data to a CSV. You'd have to upload a new file. But with databases, you can have it so that there's a job that like adds new data as a batch thing, or maybe the database updates in real time from like Internet of Things devices. Maybe it updates using log data. Depends on what kind of data you're using. Anyway, you want Zoom Data to be able to update its cache and update its metadata when this new data comes in so your data won't be stale. What does that mean? That means like if you have a job that updates your underlying data about flights every hour on the hour, you don't want no schedule, you want periodically run every hour, 1 hour, and start, let's say, 5:01. So that every hour when your underlying data source updates, then Zoom Data will also realize that and update its own data, metadata, and cache, so that whenever you're looking at your chart, you're looking at the very latest data. If you need a more complicated updating schedule than what this gives us, you can hit Advanced, and that'll let you actually enter a cron string here. So if you've ever used cron, it'll let you use the same format to set up how often you want to update this data. Now, in our case, our data is actually from 2015, and it's historical. So we don't actually ever need to update it, so we can just click No Schedule. For reference, this configuration tab here lets you check which fields need updating. For example, let's say one of your fields, the range never changes, and that data is not cached. You're not going to have to update that field. But if your time fields update, then maybe you will only want to update those fields. So this lets you select which fields you want updated. Now I'm going to hit Next, and it's going to save this connection and move on to chart-specific settings. So these are the settings that affect individual charts, as well as some global settings, like for the time bar. So as with before, we're going to set the time attribute to scheduled departure, enable playback, change our time range, and let's just hit time presets max available range. So it'll just show us the whole year 2015. You can also do this by going to January 1st, 2015 and December 31st, 2015 and selecting those. In this case, I just wanted to showcase this time presets capability. There are other defaults we can change as well. For example, with the CSV, we changed group to origin airport. Or we could change the line trends, trend attributes to scheduled departure. But for now, let's just hit finish and see if this data uploaded correctly. So now that we've finished it, it's saved. You can see it down in this list here, right here. And we have this nice handy shortcut. And let's create a bar chart and see if this displays properly. All right, so over here we can see that all the airports from the larger data set have loaded in. And this is actually just the top 50 airports. If we raise the limit, we should be able to see all the airports that are included in this data set. And this is for the whole year 2015. One thing to note is right now, Zoom Data is crunching 5.8 million rows to come up with with these volume values for numbers of flights. So that just goes to show that if your underlying data source can handle it, Zoom Data can be very fast and very responsive when visualizing very large amounts of data. And really, 5.8 million isn't that much in terms of big data volumes. Zoom Data really starts showing some of its data sharpening capabilities and some of the more big data geared functionality when you start hitting 1 billion rows and higher. Anyway, you can roll over these different airports to see values like their volume. You can change your metrics to, let's say, departure delay. Let's do average departure delay to see different views into the data. And really, what we're going to be focusing on going forward is visualizing this data and coming up with different ways and teaching different functionality that will help you create charts and dashboards with the data that we've now connected. And so that's what's going to be in visualizing data. And so hopefully I will see you in that video.